on to our very last section of ecology for Biology 20 IB, and this is on theories of evolution. And notice it says theories, not laws or hypotheses. So theories are not laws, so they are not considered to be proven beyond any doubt, but they do have substantial evidence to support moving from just a hypothesis to a theory. Now, please make sure that you do watch that clip on evolution, because just like in our last assessment, when I told you to watch that video, there will be a question or two on our evolution assessment based on the information on that material. So make sure you take a look, because it is a very good introduction to this section. So there's a lot of scientists that have contributed to the theory of evolution, going all the way back to Aristotle and many other individuals in between, to basically kind of our modern day scientists, and of course probably the most famous of which is Charles Darwin. So over the years, many scientists have speculated on how the diversity of organisms actually developed and occurred on our planet, and that was before the theory of natural selection. And the theory of natural selection itself is something that is very strongly associated with Charles Darwin, who we will take a look at. But I just wanted to mention what the scientific definition of evolution is, because a lot of times it becomes very complicated and kind of mixed in with religious beliefs and pseudoscience and all kinds of other different things. And in fact, from a strictly scientific point of view, evolution is simply the term used to describe gradual changes in organisms over time. So we did say that there are and have been many scientists throughout history, starting with Aristotle, who contributed to evolutionary theory. But in our program of studies, there is in fact only two of them that we need to know. I already mentioned Charles Darwin, and the other one that we need to know is this individual here, who is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, mostly just called Lamarck. And he lived from 1724 to 1839. Now, he was a French naturalist who tried to explain how species do change over time. So in other words, how does that concept or that idea of evolution actually happen? And what he did is he applied a theory called the inheritance of acquired traits. And I want you to think back to your previous knowledge on some of these terms here. So inheritance implies that it's in the genetic material, right? So things that are inherited from biological parents. So things like eye color, attached earlobes versus unattached earlobes, tongue rolling, skin color, all of these things that we inherit from a genetic standpoint. And then he puts into this theory the concept of acquired traits. And if you remember anything from biology in your previous years of study, acquired means something that is acquired during an individual's lifetime. So that would be something like a tattoo, learning how to play the guitar. Okay, so something that is not genetically inherited. So you can see that there's kind of a dichotomy there, or kind of a oxymoron in a sense, because you cannot inherit acquired traits. But in any case, this was Lamarck's kind of general theory to explain how organisms did change over time. So what did this really mean? It meant that not only could an organism obtain new traits over its lifetime, so that's the acquire part, but then it could also transfer those acquired traits to their offspring. Okay, now he was wrong about that, okay, because we cannot inherit acquired traits. So in other words, if you get a tattoo and when you have a baby, the baby's not going to have a tattoo, okay? So just because you learn how to speak French doesn't mean your baby is going to be born learning how to speak French, okay? So acquired traits cannot be transmitted from parent to offspring. So he was wrong about that piece. What he was right about, however, okay, so this part, wrong, okay? You can't acquire traits and then pass them on to your offspring. What he was right about, however, was that he believed that it was the conditions of the environment, okay? So the physical environment, what was going on with climate, vegetation, niches, food, habitat, all that stuff. It was the environment that pressured individuals to actually change. So he was right about that part of his theory, but the part about the acquired traits was untrue. It was a very controversial statement at the time, and it was very controversial because it did not seem intuitive. And in fact, it was very easily proven to be false in a laboratory setting. So for example, experiments were done such as cutting tails off mice, okay, so docking tails, and then letting that generation of mice breed and have offspring. And then if Lamarck's theory were true, that would mean that the baby mice would not have tails either. But of course they did. All right. So it was very easily disproved in terms of that piece of his theory. Weirdly, though, in spite of the fact that there were lots of experiments that disproved Lamarck's theory, it persisted for actually a very, very long time. And in fact, he did not really like some of the other naturalists that kind of contradicted him. So this is the most famous of Lamarck's graphics, and it's called, in fact, Lamarck's giraffe. So this was an example that Lamarck used to actually just sort of give a visual and describe what his theory meant. And so one thing that I want you to remember here is that this is not like generations of giraffes. Okay, so this is not like this guy here is not like a prehistoric giraffe, and then this is like a present day giraffe, and then like millions of years have passed in between those two. This is the same giraffe. Okay, so at some point in its life, this giraffe had a short, stumpy neck. But then what Lamarck said is this giraffe with this short neck was driven by an inner need to reach a better food source, which was high up in the trees. So what this giraffe did is it actually would stretch its neck, okay, and keep stretching its neck to reach those leaves, and keep stretching its neck and stretching and stretching until later on in its life, remember this is the same giraffe, okay, in its lifespan. So this is the giraffe as a baby, and this is the same giraffe, as an older adult. And so later in its lifetime, this giraffe, driven by its inner need to stretch its neck to reach that desirable food source of those acacia leaves in the trees, it would get this long neck by the end of its lifetime. And then, okay, so that was the environment piece. Okay, so that, isn't really super wrong, except for the fact that the giraffe can, stretch its neck and get a long neck in its lifetime. But he still was right about the piece that it was the environment that was pressuring change, okay, putting pressure on individual organisms to adapt. Okay, but then, according to Lamarck's theory, when this final version of the giraffe actually reproduced and had offspring, the offspring would also have a long neck, okay? So the acquired piece was this short-necked original giraffe acquiring this long neck through its lifetime. And then the inheritance piece of Lamarck's theory was that once that older giraffe had offspring, its offspring would have longer necks as well. So when we look at this today, it seems ridiculous to us, but at the time, it actually was a theory that was considered. So now we're going to move on to Charles Darwin, who definitely is considered to be the father of evolution, evolutionary theory, and I'm sure you've heard of him before. So he was kind of a very private man and actually a very modest man. And he did have the opportunity, however, to travel around the entire coast of South America on, and particularly those Galapagos Islands. And as a naturalist, he took copious notes. He was an exceptional artist as well, drew wonderful graphics of the organisms that he saw there, and kind of on his voyage to map the coast of South America, developed his theory of natural selection. So what happened when he was traveling is that he saw many similar species on the different islands of the Galapagos. So they were similar to one another. So different species of finches, different species of lizards, different species of iguanas, that kind of thing. And it made him actually think about, this is really weird that we have all of these organisms that are somewhat similar, yet a little bit different at the same time, particularly with the finches when it came to their beaks and the types of food sources that they would be able to access with those different types of beaks. And so it caused him to think about, hey, did these organisms, did all of these different species of finches, of iguanas, etc., of tortoises, did they come from a common ancestor? And so in 1859, he published his book, which is arguably one of the most famous of the scientific pieces of literature of all time. And it was titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And this quote by Darwin, I think, says kind of sums up his theory in a bit of a nutshell. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So, in other words, whichever individual was most capable of adapting to its environment, surviving, and reproducing is the one that is going to actually have its genetic material pass on from one generation to the next. I want you to pay super, super, super close attention to this slide. This is a very, very important slide. A good chunk of the material that will be covered on your evolution quiz is from this slide, okay? And the reason for this is that Darwin's theory of natural selection was based on the premise that 5 conditions existed, okay, in terms of a natural habitat for an organism. So the first one of the 5 conditions that are necessary in order for the theory of natural selection to actually be potentially true. The first one is as follows. It's called overproduction or overpopulation. I think that is pretty self-explanatory. Overpopulation or overproduction means that there are going to be lots of individuals born within a species, okay? But not all of them are going to survive and reproduce or even live to maturity. And an example would be that is if you ever watch the graphics of when a sea turtle's eggs hatch on the beach and you have all those little baby sea turtles, literally hundreds and hundreds of them rushing to get to the ocean, and they're all being eaten by gulls and albatrosses and fish in the water and everything. Out of those hundreds and hundreds of little hatchlings that actually are hatched and try to make it across that beach, only a handful of them, literally 2 or 3, will actually make it to maturity. Okay, so that was the first point for Darwin's theory of natural selection, is there is going to be overpopulation. And because there is overpopulation, that kind of leads to the next concept, which is competition or the struggle for existence. So all of those little baby turtles were competing with one another to make it to the ocean first and not be eaten. Okay, when there is overpopulation of a certain species, you have to remember there's only so many resources to go around, right? There's all those limiting factors. There's only so much food. There's only so much space. There's only so many mates. So all of those individuals in a species are in competition with one another. Okay, that remember we called that intraspecific competition, and they are always it's always necessary for them to compete with one another in order to survive. Okay, the third of the ideas that are necessary to support Darwin's theory of natural selection is variation. And we talked about this before. Okay, remember we talked about variation within a species, variation among species. Okay, so with respect to variation within a species, remember when we have organisms that reproduce sexually, okay, this means that they are not absolutely identical to one another. And in fact, if you think of our Bio 20 IB class and you kind of remember all the different people we had in our class, we are all the same species. We are all Homo sapiens. Okay, from a genetic standpoint, we have the same genome, same number of chromosomes. The genes are found on the same place, on the same chromosome for all of us. Okay, but you could see the variation that we have among the individuals in our classroom. So tremendous variation due to sexual reproduction, okay? So no 2 individuals are going to be identical, particularly when sexual reproduction is involved, okay? So that kind of leads to our next point, which is survival of the fittest. I'm sure you've probably heard that term before, and this is the natural selection piece. Now, in terms of being fit, that doesn't necessarily mean, like it said in Darwin's quote, the most intelligent, the fastest, the biggest. It kind of just means whichever individual is best suited to the environment at that time, okay? So whichever individual has those advantageous variations, remember we talked about that, the selective advantage. So it has just slightly different traits that make it better able to compete and survive and hopefully reproduce, okay? That is natural selection. Whoever is best suited to the environment is going to be more likely to survive, reach maturity, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring. And then those traits predictably, should become more commonplace in the population. So Darwin's term survivor, okay, means the individual whose traits gets passed on from one generation to the next. So the survivor has different characteristics that allow it to survive, mature, reproduce, and pass those traits on to the next generation of that species. So the last of the conditions that are necessary to support Darwin's theory, now again, remember these are the conditions that Darwin said exist in order for his theory of natural selection to actually be viable. So this isn't proof, these are conditions, okay? So the last one of those 5 is something called the origin of a new species, and that is more commonly known as speciation, okay? So make note of that word, speciation. So basically, speciation just means creation of a new species over time. So over many generations of passing on advantageous adaptations, so you have those survivors, as Darwin called them. You had them better suited to the environment because they had slightly different characteristics. So they lived, reached sexual maturity, passed their traits on to their offspring. Many, many generations of this happening over and over again is something that eventually would lead to the creation of a new species that was somewhat different from what we call the ancestral stock or the ancestral species. Okay, so that's what speciation is. It's creation of a new species over time because the environment is always selecting the individuals that are best suited to the environment, and they survive and reproduce and pass those traits on. Okay, so just for a visual here, because of course Darwin's finches are very, very famous, what he was talking about with speciation was the fact that he believed that there was an ancestral finch. Okay, so you can see this would be the ancestral finch that lived whatever, hundreds or even thousands of years previous. Over time, as the islands diverged from one another and the distance became greater and populations of birds stayed on individual islands where there were potentially different resources, different food sources, over time, individuals on those islands were selected because they had advantageous characteristics. And so we created new species of finches from that original ancestral finch. So eventually we had seed-eating finches. We had insect-eating woodpecker-type finches. We had insect-eating finches that would just pick insects from the ground or from the trees, right? And all of those, according to Darwin, were from an original ancestral finch. But over time, because the populations were segregated or lived apart on different islands, certain finches that had beaks that were better suited to the food sources on those islands were selected. They were the fittest, they were the survivors, and they passed those beak characteristics on to their offspring. Over time, many, many generations passed, and we had a new species of finch that was different from the ancestral finch. So this is very similar, this graphic on the right here, except that you can see these are more detailed and more realistic looking images of the different species of finches that are currently found on the Galapagos Islands. So those 5 areas that we talked about before, the speciation, the competition, the overpopulation or overproduction, etc. Remember that those were the 5 kind of conditions that Darwin said existed in order to facilitate or push natural selection, right? So when a theory is developed, it's not enough to say, oh yeah, this is what I think, and these are the things that exist. So I think my theory is true because there is overpopulation and we do see new species developing and we discover new species and we see evidence of competition in populations, etc., etc. That isn't enough. What we actually need now is we need evidence or we need some proof to substantiate the theory of natural selection. So we have another 5 things here, which are also very, very important. So there's 5 key areas of study that are used to support the theory of natural selection. Those are fossil evidence. I think you can probably think about what that means. So that's paleontology. What does the fossil record tell us in terms of how species have changed over time? Biogeography, let's break that term down. So bio means living things. Geography, of course, means the earth in terms of the topography or the surface characteristics of the earth. So what kinds of living things live in different parts of the earth with similar geography. Comparative anatomy, so if we compare the anatomy of different organisms, okay. Embryology is the comparison of organisms as they develop, either in utero or in eggs or whatever, depending on what type of species they are, and comparing the embryonic development of different organisms and then comparing them and looking for similarities and looking for differences. But probably the trump card today is biochemistry, because biochemistry is the comparison of the genetic makeup of different organisms. And that is the one that is most useful today. So the others are still in our program of studies, and so we do review them. But the comparison of DNA today is what actually allows us to definitively prove relationships between different species and how closely related they are. So let's take a look at the first one, which is fossil evidence. So there's a few terms that you need to be familiar with here. And the first one is the law of superposition. Now I want you to notice that this is a law. This is not a theory. Okay, so this is something that no one has been able to disprove with repeated and repeated and repeated investigations, and so it is considered to be a law. And very simply, if we look at the graphics at the right here, this is what it means. In undisturbed rock layers, and it's very important that we say undisturbed, so they haven't been tilted or cracked or inverted or anything by natural events like earthquakes or volcanoes or anything like that. So they are undisturbed. Okay, so in undisturbed rock layers, the law of superposition states that the rock layers that are on the bottom are the oldest, and therefore will have the most primitive organisms, or in other words, the organisms that lived the furthest back in terms of the history of our planet. And then as we go up, the rock layers become younger, and therefore the organisms that are found in those higher rock layers that are closer to the surface are going to be quote unquote newer in terms of when they appeared in the fossil record, or when they appeared on the planet. Okay, so the law of superposition is the first thing that we kind of have to get our heads around. But remember that this is in undisturbed rock layers. Okay, so the bottom and the things found in the bottom layers are the oldest, and as we go up towards the surface, the rock layers and therefore the remains of the organisms in those rock layers are newer or more recent in terms of history. Now, the next thing that we have to know in terms of terminology is transitional fossils. Okay, and strata just means a rock layer. Okay, so when we talk about lower strata versus higher strata, that just means the layers of rock. Okay, so oldest strata, youngest rock layer, youngest strata. Okay, so what's a transitional fossil? Well, paleontologists look for transitional fossils as support of evolution. And one of the kind of, I suppose I should say, one of the most established, I guess is the right word, for the transitional fossils is the horse. So if we look at the recent horse, okay, which is Equus equus, its scientific name is Equus equus. If we look at the skeletons of recent horses, and then we compare that to organisms in the fossil record, we can kind of see what we mean by transitional fossils. So even before actually the Mesohippus was an even smaller horse-like creature called the Eohippus, and that stands for dawn horse, like dawn as in like morning dawn, Eohippus. And Eohippus was about the size of like a smallish dog, not like Chihuahua, but like a beagle maybe, like a small dog. And they had multiple toes instead of a single hoof, all right? And then as we kind of go up here from our most primitive, or the earliest fossil evidence of a horse-like creature, which is Eohippus, up to the modern horse, Equus equus, what we have in between is these other guys. And so these other guys, the Mesohippus and the Merychippus, etc., they would be what we would consider transitional fossils. So they are the in-betweeners, okay? So in between the most primitive, okay, that would be found in the oldest strata, okay, compared to the most recent, which is the present day horse. Okay, so that's what transitional fossils are. Very recently, well, by recently I mean within the last 10 years, there was kind of a really big deal about finding some the Arc'teryx, which actually I think is now a skiing or an outdoor brand too. But anyway, and that particular fossil was considered to be the transitional fossil between dinosaurs and present day birds. So like velociraptors and then present day birds. Okay, so there's been a lot of kind of, I don't know, controversy, I guess, with that one. So some paleontologists believe it is a transitional fossil, some do not. And in fact, transitional fossils are quite rare. So even though fossil evidence is used to support theories of natural selection and evolution, there aren't a lot of transitional fossils that are considered to be valid in terms of supporting the theory of natural selection and evolution. So the next sort of study, or area of study, I should say, that supports natural selection and theory of evolution is something called biogeography. So what biogeography aims to do is it aims to identify organisms that are similar to one another on different continents when the environmental conditions are close to one another, okay? So this indicates that they probably arose from a common ancestor. So again, if you remember in your previous studies of science, you probably remember that at once it was believed that the Earth was just one solid landmass called Pangaea, and then over time the continents broke apart and drifted away from each other. And so that is kind of used to support evolution, and the reason why we do have organisms that are similar to one another, but they live on entirely different continents. And so if we look at this graphic here with the anteaters and so on, so you can see that in North America we have like a giant armadillo, in Africa giant anteater, a giant pangolin in Africa, and a spiny anteater in Oceania. So all of these so different continents, but yet these organisms are very similar to one another. Okay, so they are insectivores, they have some type of like armor, they have claws at the front. So, and even from a genetic standpoint, when we do genetic analysis on these individual organisms, they are quite related to one another. And so, you know, we kind of say, okay, well, how could that be when they are so far apart? So it's believed that they probably had a common ancestor, but as Pangaea broke apart and the continents drifted, and the populations were then segregated from one another, then natural selection kicked in. So the individuals that were more likely to survive and reproduce because they had advantageous traits did so, and over time we had speciation of these new organisms. And the same is true if we take a look at the camel family on the right. So in the same way that organisms on islands often resemble organisms on the mainland, biogeography is used to support the theory of natural selection. Very important slide here. Make sure again that you pay attention to the instruction here and make sure you understand it, because comparative anatomy is very, very important in terms of just understanding how scientists will use the study of comparing anatomies of different organisms as a means to support the theory of natural selection. So there's two terms that we have to be comfortable with here. And the first one is homologous, okay? So remember what that prefix homo means. Homo means the same, okay? So homologous organs have similar structures, okay? So when we say similar structures, we mean that when we look at the bones, when we look at the structure of the bones, the anatomy, the tendons, all that kind of stuff, they are very, very similar in terms of anatomy, but they do not necessarily, and this is the key here, they do not necessarily have the same function. But because they are similar from an anatomical point of view, they are considered to be more related to one another. So the best way to actually look at this is to look at an example of homology. So here we have a bat wing, we have a mouse forelimb, okay? So a mouse-like leg, right? And then we have a human arm. And so if we look at the anatomy on all these three mammals, you can see the similarities there. You can see the similarities in the bone structure, you can see the similarities in the number of digits, okay, or in this case the toes for the little mouse, and the bat wing, right? They have the phalanges there. So you can definitely see the similarities, right, in terms of the anatomical structure. So that's the homology piece, right? So very similar in anatomy. However, what the animals use these for are very different, right? So a bat wing is for flying, a mouse forelimb is used for walking, and a human arm is used for grasping and whatever, but not locomotion, right? So this means then that because the anatomy is very similar, these organisms are closely related to one another, or more closely than an organism that does not have that same anatomical structure in its arm or its forelimb. Okay, so the other one is analogous. Okay, so when we look at analogous organs, this means that the structure is different. Okay, so from an anatomical point of view, okay, they are not similar at all. All right, but they may have the same function or may be used for the same thing. But because the anatomy is different, the structure is different, they are not as closely related. And again, the best way to understand this is to look at an example. So all three of these organisms have wings. Okay, so bats have wings, butterflies have wings, birds have wings, we could say bees have wings, etc., etc. And they're all used for the same thing, right? They're all used for flying. However, from an anatomical point of view, they are very, very different. So if we were to dissect all of these wings and compare them anatomically, they're very different from one another. Like the butterfly wing doesn't have bones. The bird wing has hollow bones and doesn't have the 5 phalanges like the bat wing does, etc. So analogy means that they are similar to one another or analogous in their function, but they are not the same in terms of their anatomical structure. And what that means is that those organisms are less related. So a bat and a mouse and a human are much more closely related to one another than a bat, a butterfly, and a bird. The next one that we'll take a look at as evidence for evolution is the study of embryonic development, or embryology. And embryology is the study of the changes an organism will go through as an embryo as it develops. So either in utero if it's a mammal, in an egg if it's a bird or a fish or an amphibian or whatever. Okay, so the idea behind embryology is that if there are similar patterns of development, okay, so in other words, as the organism is developing embryonically, many of the stages are very similar to one another, then we would say, at least this is what the theory was, that the organisms are actually more closely related to one another. Now, these drawings here were done by a scientist named Haeckel, and Haeckel's drawings were done in support of natural selection, and probably even more than that, to sort of further his career as an embryologist and a scientist. And in fact, these drawings that were done by Haeckel ended up in many, many, many science textbooks over the year. But when they were looked at more closely and it was kind of investigated in later years, after Haeckel's death even, it was discovered that he actually drew some of the stages of embryonic development in the different organisms to make them appear more closely related than they actually were. So he kind of fudged and kind of, took liberties with his drawings, I guess you could say. So embryology today is not considered to be a very valid area of study in terms of comparing the relatedness between organisms or supportive evolution anymore, okay? And I kind of like this quote here too. It says, "I think it's fascinating that Haeckel's drawings are some of the most controversial pictures in the history of science, and yet they became some of the most routinely used." And that was a historian of science at the University of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it was from his book, Haeckel's Embryos, Images, Evolution, and Fraud, because his drawings are considered now to be fraudulent because he basically made certain organisms look more similar to one another than they actually were, to actually support his own career and to support theories of evolution. So the last of the pieces of evidence for evolution is the biochemistry. And as I mentioned, this is the study of DNA or genetic material. And this is emerging as the most important tool that is used to compare not only organisms that exist in present day and comparing how closely related they are to one another, but also when we have remains from organisms that are now extinct, and we can actually use, if there's viable DNA samples, we can actually use those DNA samples to compare to present day organisms as well. So when we talk about comparison of DNA, what we mean is this. Partially what we mean is the number of chromosomes. So for example, humans have 46, apes have 48, dogs have 78, a cabbage has 8. And so it's not only comparing chromosomal number, however, it also is saying, okay, how many chromosomes are there, but which genes are on which chromosomes, where are those genes on those chromosomes, and most importantly, what do those genes do? So that's what we mean when we talk about the genome. So we now know, for example, with humans, we know which genes actually code for eye color and where they are, okay, which chromosomes they're on. We know which gene codes for cystic fibrosis, and we know where that gene is. We know where the breast cancer genes are, okay, on human chromosomes, etc. So that is what is emerging as the most important piece, because we can compare different organisms and in doing that comparison, establish how closely related they are to one another. Now, in cases where we found the remains of organisms that are still intact enough to extract DNA, that's emerging as a super important thing too. So for example, a couple years back, I'd say probably 5 or 6 years ago, an entire little woolly mammoth was found intact, frozen somewhere in some cave in Siberia in Russia, and it had been frozen for thousands of years, and it was discovered, but it actually still even had tissue, like it was still a fully formed little woolly mammoth. And so scientists were then able, of course, to extract genetic material from that tissue, from that woolly mammoth, and then use it to compare the genome of that little woolly mammoth to present day African and Asian elephants. So for this slide here, kiddos, you'll notice that it says IB, and it doesn't mean that you don't have to know what speciation is, because we already talked about speciation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But it's just that the two terms on this slide, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation specifically, are not in our program of studies for Alberta, but they are in the Alberta program of studies. But for this slide, what I really, really need you to do is I need you to watch this speciation video, because it is an excellent discussion on how speciation occurs and the methods by which speciation can happen. And those are in the program of studies. So you definitely need to know that. And so please make sure that you do watch this video. There will be assessment questions on that, kiddos, okay? Okay, kiddos, we just have a couple concepts left to go. And the first one is kind of co-concept, transformation and divergence. So when we talk about transformation, just as an umbrella term, transformation means when a new species develops and it replaces an old species, okay? So think of it this way. You have an older species, and then over many, many years, it transforms into a new species and replaces the old one. Okay, so that piece is important, that the old one is no longer in existence, okay? So when we talk about divergent evolution, this is defined as the process of two or more related species becoming more and more dissimilar to one another, okay? So they diverge from each other. And again, keep in mind that this also means that the ancestral species disappears, okay? But the two new versions keep diverging from one another, getting less and less similar over time. Now, when you have this happening multiple times, so you have many, many species diverging from one another from a common ancestor, and they all have unique adaptations for their environment. This is called adaptive radiation. So sometimes this can be a little bit confusing, but just keep in mind that adaptive radiation is a type of divergence, okay? It just means that instead of just two species growing more and more dissimilar from one another, you have multiple species. So that would be like with those Galapagos finches. You don't just have two species of finches that evolved from that ancestral finch species, which then disappeared. You have multiple different finch species that have evolved from that ancestral finch species. So here's just a few examples of the adaptive radiation that we talked about. And remember, this is a type of divergence. But instead of just having two species that diverge from the ancestral species and from each other, you have multiple species. So if we take a look at the graphic on the left here, here's an example of those finches that we've been talking about a lot, but that's kind of considered to be one of Darwin's most famous and legitimate examples, I guess we could say. So here we have this ancestral seed-eating ground finch. This species of finch no longer exists, but it's believed that all of these other species of finches that are found on the different islands, so the tree finch and woodpecker finch, warbler finch, etc., all of these different finches basically came from that ancestral seed-eating finch, and then they also diverged from each other. Okay, so you have multiple different species radiating out from that ancestral seed-eating ground finch. And if we look at the example on the right here, this is an ancestral bear. So this is called, I think it's called the cephalogale. Cephalogale, yeah. And of course, this ancestral species no longer exists today. But if we take a look at all of these other bear species, so we have a black bear, we have a grizzly, we have a polar bear, we have a panda, we have a sloth bear, we have a spectacled bear, and so on. So all these different bears. And they are all still related to one another. They're all still, members of that Ursus family, but they have diverged from one another, right? Radiated out from that ancestral species, and of course that ancestral species, that cephalogale, no longer exists. Okay, so those are just a couple examples of adaptive radiation, and of course remember what this means. This means that we have had transformation from an ancestral species to multiple current day species. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how speciation actually happens. Okay, so we know what adaptive radiation means. We know that speciation means the development of a new species from an ancestral species, and so on and so on. But what is the idea behind how this actually happens? And the ones that we kind of have to cover here are geographical isolation and reproductive isolation. Okay, so let's just take a look here. So species may arise or, change from that ancestral to current day due to either geographical isolation or reproductive isolation. But one thing I want you to remember is this. The key there is isolation. So that means that parts of a population are separated from one another for whatever reason, geographical reasons, reproductive reasons, the ice age, who knows, whatever, but they become separated from one another for some reason, and they no longer can reproduce with one another because of that geographical isolation, or they no longer are capable of reproducing with one another because of reproductive isolation. Okay, so and again, this is why it's really, really important to watch that video on speciation, because it gives a lot of really good examples of geographical and reproductive isolation. So just in very simplistic terms, geographical isolation is pretty much what the name implies. So something geographical is separating members of a population so that they no longer can mate with one another. So this could be an ocean, this could be a mountain, okay? So the end result, though, is because there is something physical that is separating the two populations over time, they can actually develop different characteristics and speciation can result. Okay, so think of those finches again. They were separated by big bodies of water, especially as those Galapagos Islands floated further and further apart from one another. They no longer could migrate from island to island. It was too far. And so those populations of ancestral finches eventually transformed into new species because they no longer could reproduce with individuals from all the other islands. The next one is what we call reproductive isolation, and this can mean a couple of different things. So reproductive isolation can mean that there may be some type of biological barrier. And in the video, if you watch the Bozeman video, it talks about the snails and how the snails, some of them kind of wind clockwise or counterclockwise, and some of them wind clockwise. And so their reproductive organs, because their openings in their shells are in different places, the reproductive organs actually can't come into contact with one another. So they can't physically reproduce even if they wanted to. The parts don't fit, okay? But it doesn't just mean that there could be a biological barrier like that, like an actual physical barrier. It could also be behaviors, okay? So when you have populations that have been separated for a really long time, they may no longer recognize each other as members of the same species anymore. Maybe the bird call, the mating call is different. Maybe the mating dance is different, or they do different things in terms of trying to attract mates, and they no longer recognize one another as members of the same species. So there's lots of different reasons why reproductive isolation can actually happen, okay? And the last one is temporal isolation. And also in the video, I think it kind of says, think of temporal in terms of time. So think of, T for temporal stands for time. And what this means is it doesn't mean that they are not capable of reproducing, but it means they don't, because they actually have mating seasons at different time of the year, okay? Or different times of the day. And as a result, even though they could, because they're closely related to one another, reproduce, they don't, because their breeding times are different. I just wanted to give you a few examples of those different types of isolation that we talked about, which can result in a new species. So at least we're not looking at the finches anymore. These are actually what we call honey creepers, okay? So if we take a look at these different bird species here, this is an example of geographical isolation. So these are Hawaiian honey creeper species. And so what that means is these honey creepers are found on different islands, okay? And again, even the Hawaiian Islands, they were formed by volcanic activity, right, on the ocean floor. And as those volcanoes erupted, the islands were formed, but they continued to drift apart from one another. And so it's believed that there was an ancestral bird, okay, from which all of these honey creepers actually transformed, but these different species are isolated from one another on different islands. So over time, they could not reproduce with one another because there was that geographical separation of the water. And so over time, they developed into different species because the populations were isolated in that way, okay? Temporal, remember temporal means time. So here we have an example of two different types of toads. We have the American toad, which I believe is the bigger one there, and then we have the Fowler's toad. And the toads are actually very closely related to one another in terms of their genetics, and they actually can reproduce with one another, but they don't, because one of them reproduces in the fall and the other one reproduces in the spring. And so they become sexually active at different times of the year. So even though they could reproduce with one another, they don't, because they are not in their mating seasons at the same time. Now, we've talked about the example of, so for reproductive isolation, we've talked about the example of the horse and the donkey and the mule before. And just keep in mind that this is one example of reproductive isolation. This is what we call post-zygotic, okay? Post-zygote. Okay, so zygote is a fertilized egg, right? So this is what we call post-zygotic. So the reason why this is considered reproductive isolation is because remember what we said about the mules before. Mules themselves are sterile. They cannot reproduce with one another, okay? And however, the horse and the donkey can, but the mules cannot. And so that is still considered to be reproductive isolation, because we're never going to form a new species of mule that is capable of reproducing with themselves, okay? It's always the result of the union between the female horse and the male donkey. So that would be an example of post-zygotic reproductive isolation. Pre-zygotic would mean when the egg and sperm don't unite in the first place, because the species are very incompatible. Okay, so if you try to cross two organisms that are very different from one another from a genetic standpoint, the egg and the sperm would never unite in the first place. So that would be an example of pre-zygotic reproductive isolation. So there's a lot of different examples of reproductive isolation. Once again, make sure you watch that video on speciation, because it does give you a lot of And kiddos, this is just the kind of text for the examples that I gave you in case you needed to read that over for study purposes, okay? So our very, very final concepts for our ecology unit are gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. And these are both theories that have been proposed about how evolution actually occurs. Does it occur gradually or does it occur quickly in spurts? Okay, so evolution can happen at different rates. It depends what species that we're talking about. So if we have species that reproduce very quickly and they have multiple offspring, and they reach sexual immaturity fast, and they have a very short lifespan, etc. So things like insects, we can actually see evolution happen relatively quickly. Okay, with mammals, okay, we see things happen relatively slowly. So typically, it's expected that the rate of evolution is slow because natural selection takes time to happen. Environments typically don't change overnight, right? So it's typically a slow pace. And when we have these small changes happening in the environment over very long periods of time, and we have that natural selection piece happening over many hundreds, even thousands, millions of years, and we eventually get new species, this is called gradualism. So, the name implies it all. It's something that happens slowly and gradually over time. So, this is historically the accepted theory when it comes to evolution. When a species has had little or no change for a very long period of time, it's said to be in equilibrium, okay? And equilibrium can last for hundreds of years, thousands of years, even millions of years if there are not any dramatic changes in the environmental conditions. However, the second theory, which is punctuated equilibrium, states that even if a species has been in equilibrium for a very long time, if there is a super dramatic environmental change, okay, then this may force the creation of a new species in a very short period of time, even just a few generations. And this is called punctuated equilibrium. So think of the example of, I guess, the most accepted theory for why the dinosaurs disappeared. And in case you're not aware of what the most accepted theory is, most of the evidence points to the meteor strike or meteorite strike theory, so that very large meteorites struck the Earth, and that caused a big, immense dust cloud to go up into the sky for many, many years, blocking out sunlight, which of course killed producers, which then of course in turn killed consumers, and so on and so on. So that's the biggest kind of, or the most accepted theory when it comes to the disappearance of the dinosaur. And so that would be an example of something that may force punctuated equilibrium. Okay, so when you have this very dramatic change in the environment, and then it truly is survival of the fittest. So which individuals within certain species are capable of surviving. Now, clearly, the dinosaurs were not, okay, but there were organisms that did survive. Insects survived, certain species of plants survived, and even small mammals survived as well. And so, those individuals that were most capable of withstanding that dramatic environmental change were the ones that survived, reproduced, and passed those traits on to the offspring, potentially resulting in new species in a very short period of time. Now, the scientist who actually put forward this theory of punctuated equilibrium is one that was very concerned about the fact that there are very few transitional fossils. So remember we said before that there's not a lot of transitional fossils that kind of support theories of natural selection and evolution. And this is kind of how some scientists, paleontologists are kind of getting around that, is kind of saying, well, maybe evolution doesn't have to happen gradually. Maybe if there's a cataclysmic change in the environment, evolution can happen really quickly, and that would help explain the lack of transitional fossils in the fossil record. So just the visual to add to our understanding of the difference between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. I just thought it would be good to have a little visual here just to kind of help us with our understanding of that. One thing I want to point out first is that sometimes you'll see the term phyletic gradualism because it applies to these graphics, which are phyletic trees, okay? But it's the same as gradualism. So don't be thrown if you see the term phyletic gradualism. That is the same as gradualism. So if we look at our visual over here of our butterflies to kind of help us understand the difference between the theory of gradualism and the theory of punctuated equilibrium, we can see that here we have our ancestral butterfly, okay? And then we have divergence happening here, right? Because we end up with two different species which have diverged from one another, and both of whom are different from our ancestral butterfly species, right? But you can see that things are happening quite gradually here. So as we have divergence happening, these butterflies are a little bit different, and then these next two are a little bit more different, and so on and so on. But it's happening at a predictable and gradual pace, okay? As those organisms develop and acquire unique adaptations, et cetera, until we end up with those two more current species. Now, in the punctuated equilibrium model, if we look at, this is the same ancestral species, where we have these kind of bends here, that is what kind of applies to that environmental change. Okay, so the meteorite strikes or the earthquakes or whatever. So whatever happens in the environment, that is a very serious and very impactful environmental change. So, and you can see here what we mean now is that we've gone from this ancestral butterfly to all of a sudden this new species in a very short period of time. Okay, but then of course we also have this long period of equilibrium here, right, where we have still the same species. These would imply another very impactful environmental change. And again, we have a very short period of time in which we have the development of a new species, okay? So punctuated equilibrium is simply a means to explain that evolution, if there is a very serious environmental change, that evolution can happen quickly, especially with insects and organisms like that in a very short period of time. The gradualism model, on the other hand, is kind of what is typically accepted in terms of evolution, that evolution happens slowly and over time as organisms adapt to new environmental circumstances.